When I first moved to Spain back in 2005, there were no Brits around. I was living in a small Spanish city called Santiago de Compostela. I had a Spanish girlfriend, I shopped at the local markets, I spoke Spanish all day, every day, and I was forced to live like a local, and I loved it. But then I noticed something different over the years, different patterns in different towns, entire communities made up of British expats, British pubs, shops and clubs, almost like Britain transplanted to Spain. And it's made me ask the question, why do these bubbles exist? And what does that mean for the towns and the people around them? British migration to Spain isn't something new. In the 1980s, the southern coast, the Costa del Sol, became hugely popular, and not just with retirees and tourists, but for a different reason. A small number of British criminals saw Spain as the ideal place to lie low. The geography and the climate, of course, made it attractive. You know, it was close to the UK, it was sunny, it's relaxed, and law enforcement at the time was certainly less coordinated internationally. There were no European arrest warrants, and the booming tourist economy created amazing opportunities for these criminals in cash businesses, property and nightlife. Over time, though, a network of British expatriates, sometimes known as the Costa del Crime, this network developed and it provided a support system for those on the run from the authorities back in the UK. Tourists and wealthy foreigners were easy targets for these criminals to create scams, theft and other criminal activities. By the 1990s, improved policing and extradition agreements started to close this loophole. But this unusual chapter helped cement Spain as a known destination for British migrants. If we fast forward to today, Euro Weekly reports that there's almost 300,000 Brits officially living in Spain, but the real numbers are likely to be over 800,000 if we include seasonal residents. In towns like Benidorm, Mijas, Torrevieja and Javier, Brits can make up to 40% of the population. Entire neighbourhoods have become English. There's English signs, English pubs, English social clubs. And this is creating both opportunities and tension. So why do these British expat bubbles exist? Because it isn't just about laziness or refusing to integrate. It's way more complex than that. And to a degree, it's almost about human nature. I mean, think about it for a moment. Imagine if you packed up your entire life and you land in a country where the language, the food, the humour, the bureaucracy and the social rules are completely different. Your brain is automatically going to cling to anything that seems vaguely familiar. So how do these British expat bubbles form so easily in Spain? Well, I think there's various reasons for that. One is undoubtedly comfort and familiarity. Now, there's many Brits that move to Spain, of course, for the weather, but there's also a whole lot of people that are coming here purely because they don't feel safe in the UK anymore. The UK isn't the country it once was. So when these Brits see British pubs, British Sunday dinners, Sunday roasts, fish and chip shops, English book clubs, all of these things become little anchors for them that simply make daily life feel a little less overwhelming. The second reason is going to be the language barrier. Many Brits that are arriving here later in life are going to genuinely struggle to learn a new language. This is science-backed evidence that says this. If you come here as a child and you put your British child in a Spanish school, that child is going to be speaking Spanish very, very quickly. But for older people, it is much harder to learn a new language. And in towns where locals are used to foreigners, you can almost live a completely English existence with Spanish never being spoken. I'll give you examples. I know doctors, estate agents and supermarkets and even local councils that offer English assistance. So the bubble becomes a path of least resistance. I think the third reason as well is that people will look for ready-made social circles. Now, many coastal towns, they've already got established British communities, walking groups, dart nights, bowls clubs, Facebook groups, WhatsApp chats. And when you move somewhere new, that immediate social network is something that's incredibly appealing. It creates a sense of safety and belonging and somewhere where you can get advice from someone who's been here a lot longer than you. Then you've got migration psychology, which is when people feel vulnerable or uncertain, which is going to be common after a big move. You know, they're going to gravitate towards others who have a shared experience and the same background. And it's the same reason, if you think about it, why you have areas such as Chinatown in London that exists, or Little Italy in New York. You know, humans build tribes. Then, of course, I'd say you've got lifestyle differences. Spanish culture is deeply social, but in a different way. Late dinners, family-centred weekends and a slower pace, different humour and more indirect communication. For some Brits, those differences feel exciting, but for others they feel exhausting, and the bubble again provides a familiar cultural rhythm. So why it's easy to judge this British expat bubble from the outside, once you actually look at the psychology behind it, it actually makes complete sense. Now, I've lived out my comfort zone. I've done it several times. I've lived in different countries over the years, and I know how rewarding that can be. But I also understand the temptation to stick with what feels familiar. Let's talk about the economic footprint that British migration has brought to Spain, because it's enormous, but at the same time, it's complicated. On one hand, you've got the presence of so many British residents, which is driving local economies. But then on the other hand, it's also shaping entire towns in ways that not everybody benefits from. So let's break down some of these economic factors. First of all, let's talk about property markets, because British buyers have been one of the strongest groups in the Spanish housing market for decades. And particularly in coastal areas, this has created a constant demand for villas, apartments and new developments. And for local governments and construction companies and real estate agents, that's all been a huge win. There's been jobs, investment and of course tax revenue. But for local families, especially younger people, it's a very different story. Prices have been rising faster than local wages for a long time, and whole neighbourhoods have become dominated by holiday homes or foreign-owned properties. And in some areas, Spaniards are now saying that they feel like guests in their own towns. Then, sticking with the property side of things, you've got short-term rentals and seasonal pressure. Platforms like Airbnb have certainly amplified the problem. There's many Brit-owned properties that are rented out short-term during the summer seasons. And what this means is, on a plus side, that yes, it's more tourism, which helps local economy. There's more jobs in hospitality and more local business turnover. But it also means fewer long-term rentals for local workers, nurses, teachers and young families. And the ones that do often exist cost far more than a Spanish salary can realistically cover. Then you've got the public services that are under pressure. Many of these coastal towns are small and they were never designed for tens of thousands of foreign residents plus millions of tourists. So during the peak seasons, you see healthcare clinics get overcrowded. You see rubbish collection and water systems struggle. Police and local councils face increased demand, and the roads and parking just become chaotic and to a degree impossible. Now, don't get me wrong, these towns earn good money from tourism and the British migration, but they also pay the price through stretched resources. Then you've got the local economy versus the imported economy. Now, there's also a subtle cultural shift. In some areas, British-owned businesses outnumber Spanish ones. British pubs, British barbers, British cafes, British estate agents, and just British shops. Now, this boosts employment and, of course, tourist appeal. But it can also create an imported economy that doesn't really circulate the money as widely into the local Spanish businesses. Now, some locals love the variety that this British immigration brings, but others are starting to worry that their town's cultural identity is fading. So the truth is that the British bubble brings prosperity, but it also brings challenges. The economic benefits are real, but they're also pressures that are equally real. And almost every town on the coast is trying to figure out how to keep both these sides in balance. Integration is where the bubble's limits become visible, or at least to me. Now, some British migrants will learn the language and speak it fluently. They'll join local fiestas, they'll volunteer at local charities and run businesses that enrich the local community. But then you have others that will simply remain insulated. Locals sometimes describe it as two worlds side by side, separate bars, separate social circles, and even separate newspapers. Others have expressed frustration. Many come here and complain about our culture. If they don't like it, they should return to their country. But there's also appreciation. British migrants contribute to the economy, open businesses, and bring cultural diversity. It's not black and white. It's coexistence that requires effort on both sides. I've lived both sides of this story, completely outside the bubble, but also close enough to see how tempting it can be. Now, when I first moved to Spain back in 2005, as I said, there was no British community. I was living in Santiago de Compostela. The Brits just don't go there. There was no English pub, no Sunday roast, not even an English-speaking shopkeeper. If I wanted to buy bread or fix something, it had to be in Spanish. And honestly, it was one of the best things that ever happened to me. I learnt the language because my daily survival depended on it. I had a Spanish partner, so I had no choice. But because of that, I was able to make real Spanish friends. They were the only people around me. So not only was I making their friends, I was starting to understand their way of thinking and culture. And it just opened up so many new doors to me. You know, I was getting invited to family lunches, to weddings, fiestas, and the kind of experiences that you simply don't get if you stay inside that bubble. So Spain wasn't just a place where I lived. It felt like a place that had adopted me. But there's also a twist. You know, as I started to move around Spain and live in different areas, I realised how different my own life would have been if I had landed in one of these expat bubbles where everything's available in English and you don't have to push yourself. You can stay comfortable and you can feel like you're living abroad without actually really ever stepping outside of the UK, if that makes sense. And I do get why that appeals. Moving abroad, particularly if you're alone, can be completely daunting and lonely. It can be frustrating. You feel out of place and like everyone else received the rule book that you never got. So I see why British migrants stay within that bubble, you know, and I don't judge them. I understand the comfort of hearing your own language and your own humour and your own cultural references. And I understand the relief of being able to go to a bar where, you know, if you're in that learning stage of the language, you don't have to translate your order in your head before you open your mouth. All of these things I get. They make things a lot easier for people. But I also know, on the other hand, the other side of that discomfort. You know, without me having the experience I had, I wouldn't have had those deeper friendships, the better opportunities, and a connection to Spain that I think feels real and not just rented. So my view is pretty much that there's nothing wrong with enjoying the bubble, but just don't let it become a wall. Integration isn't about giving up being British, of course it isn't, but it's also about adding a new layer to who you are. I think the future for Spain really depends on balance. So, for example, if towns can promote, language integration programs, or maybe at a higher level, even the government can look at making language part of the residency application process. There should be cultural initiatives and civic participation. From a housing perspective, I think it's hugely important that policies are put in place to ensure that locals aren't priced out. Expats should participate in local life, but at the same time still be able to enjoy their own community. I think what I'm trying to say is that it's about coexistence and not exclusion. Investment, culture, and identity can thrive together if both sides make an effort. Okay, now it's your turn. I want to hear from you. So if you're a British expat or British immigrant, as the locals prefer to call us, do you live in a bubble, or have you integrated, or are you at least trying to integrate? If you're a Spaniard, how do you experience British immigration communities, or expat communities as we call them? Comment below. Also, if you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to smash that like button. And if you haven't already subscribed, hit that as well. It's absolutely free to do. It doesn't cost a penny, but it helps this channel to continue to grow. Anyway, enjoy whatever you're doing for the rest of the day, and I'll catch you in the next one.